Welcome to the Canadian Culture Wars report. My name is Melanie Bennett, and I have something a little bit different today. Charles Adler is the new Senate appointee here in Canada. The reason I'm bringing it up is when I saw that announcement, I was obviously curious what his views would be on parental rights and gender and education and so on and so forth. And what did I come across? Well, let's look at this tweet from Charles Adler. Bigots wanting segregated classrooms wrapped themselves in parental rights a long time ago. You don't have to wear white bedsheets to show a dark heart. Parents' rights has been a bedsheet for bigots for a very long time. Well, I was not that surprised to see that attitude, frankly. The term parental rights does seem to be a particularly contentious topic, and he doesn't seem to be the only one that has these views. NDP MP Randall Garrison certainly shares those views. Let's play a clip of him.
Do you view this as a parental rights issue at all?
Well, I'd like to say, first of all, there's no such thing as parental rights. In Canada, there are parental responsibilities. And in Canadian family law, the primary responsibility of parents is to support and affirm their kids. Children have rights in Canada, and these kind of policies restrict the rights that children have in Canada.
And this does seem to have been going on for a little while in terms of the sex ed curriculum, and now more recently, some of the gender issues here in Canada pertaining to education. So much so that in Ontario, around 2018-2019, before Doug Ford was appointed the Progressive Conservative Premier of Ontario, he had promised to bring forward a parental Bill of Rights that just so happened to have quietly disappeared. So what's going on in Canada? Why are influential politicians appearing to be so hostile to parents and families? Not long ago, I made a topic about this, a video about this topic, looking at what the far right really means in parental rights in Canada, and you're welcome to go see it. I'll have a link in the description for you to click on and check out. At the time of researching for that particular video, one person did catch my attention at the time, and this person is a person that I'm going to talk about today. This person is Dr. Lauren Bialystok from the University of Toronto. So let's look at Lauren's bio. Who is she? It says here, Lauren Bialystok, Associate Professor at OISE, the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, Department of Social Justice and Education. Surprise, surprise that she caught my attention. What's her bio? Let's see here. Her area of expertise is ethics and education, identity, feminist philosophy, social and political philosophy, and women's health and sexuality. So her qualifications here are she's a philosopher and also studied German. So why am I talking about Lauren? Well, at the end of last year, 2023, I stumbled across a talk that Lauren gave at the American Sex Ed Conference talking about parental rights. The general gist of this talk, which we're going to go through today, is essentially that the state, via schools, are stakeholders in the upbringing and raising of children. Or in simpler terms, the state and teachers have a say in raising your children. Now, back at the time when I was doing that research, I didn't fully understand the significance of that talk that I listened to, but I've gained a bit of a better, fuller understanding since that time. So earlier this summer, I came across Lauren again while researching the 2019 case between the ETFO, the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario, versus the Ministry of Education over a row about the health curriculum or the curriculum in general. And this is when Doug Ford said that he would repeal a version of the so-called sex ed curriculum or the health curriculum that had caused a lot of uproar at the time. And the ETFO, the teachers' unions, the Elementary Teachers Union, took the Doug Ford government to court to stop his government making the changes. Now, in this court case, there are many, many documents. And I came across Lauren in a factum from the Ministry of Education Now, Lauren was used as an expert witness in this case, and I just want to read a little bit of what is said about Lauren. So I don't actually have the witness statement, but I do have, in this particular factum, it does talk about the different experts that were used in the case and their qualifications. And this is what the factum had to say about Lauren Bialystok. It says, Dr. Bialystok, a philosopher by training, has no degrees in education. She's never been an elementary or secondary school teacher and has never been employed by a school board. None of Dr. Bialystok's papers surveyed or interviewed students or parents of elementary school students or examined classroom instructions by elementary teachers. The only survey of Ontario teachers that Dr. Bialystok has ever conducted is a 2017 survey of teacher attitudes towards the 2015 HPE, so the Health and Physical Education curriculum. She's not aware of any other surveys or studies about the attitudes of Ontario teachers to sexual education. In cross-examination, Dr. Bialystok acknowledged that her comments in the affidavit about how teachers might react to the issuance of the 2018 HPE curriculum are not based on any survey or empirical study of teachers conducted since the issuance of the 2018 HPE curriculum. Rather, she characterizes these opinions as extrapolative. Dr. Bialystok believes that the 2015 HPE curriculum, so the old version, should be compulsory for all students, including students who are privately schooled or homeschooled. So you wouldn't have a choice, compulsory. She wrote that parents who protested the 2015 HPE curriculum preferred that their children learn about their bodies during Frosh Week on their wedding night or not at all. So already there's an attitude towards parents who may have a different opinion to the status quo. She did not agree that the statement trivializes the concern that parents might have about the curriculum. So that's an interesting framing. When I saw that and I saw that name, I said, oh my God, I have listened to her before. And I went and found that clip. So just before we start, I'm going to play this talk that she gave at the conference, and I'm going to pause and give a bit of my own personal views on it. But before I do that, I want to say thank you to a YouTuber, anti-communist, I suppose, Karlyn Borysenko. She has a live stream quite regularly. This is actually from her. She accessed the sex ed. I suspect maybe she had a ticket and she had access to it. So I don't, this is not open access. So I'm going to provide a link to Karlyn Borysenko's original coverage of this. She does do commentary on it, so you will hear her voice at times, but I edited it so it'd be a little bit smoother for us. But yeah, please feel free to go follow the link and listen to Karlyn's commentary. So let's listen to that talk.
They are appealing to this long history of a very well-meaning and generally emancipatory, positive, freedom-loving respect for rights, but they are blurring categories in ways that I think are pretty deliberate and nefarious, at least at the high levels of parental rights organizing. So unlike the kind of rights that just pertain to everybody, universal rights like I'm a human, so you can't arbitrarily kill me, for example, or rights that pertain to specific characteristics like you can't discriminate on the basis of sex, they are employing a different kind of identity, like a role identity, like I had children, and making that the basis for a rights claim. So because I had children, you owe me all these things and I'm entitled to all these freedoms because I'm a parent. That is sort of the structure of the claim. And it's not an accident because, as we've already seen, and this isn't news to you, a lot of so-called parents' rights groups are really taking aim at the rights of other specific individuals and groups of individuals. LGBTQ people are a favorite target. We saw how already the Parents' Rights in Education bill in Florida is really just a cover for trying to unroll decades of progress in LGBTQ inclusion and rights. So they see that this other group of people or other individuals have made gains in rights, in sometimes getting protection against discrimination, and in sometimes getting their experiences better represented in education. And parents' rights provides a very convenient foil against the rights of LGBTQ people or other minority groups. So by appropriating rights and identity language, parents are saying, we're a minority too, or we're discriminated against too, and you can't just give all those other people all of their rights and not give us our rights. They're implicitly equating or contrasting different kinds of rights, which are actually not the same in terms of category. Why? LGBTQ people were, in fact, legally discriminated against in many ways as individuals, deprived of the same kinds of freedoms and opportunities that all other individuals were able to access. Progress was made in recognizing and protecting the rights of LGBTQ people, including in education, for example, by not talking about families in heteronormative and exclusionary ways in schools. And so they had redress through activism that was oriented around identity and rights language.
So she says here that parents are appropriating rights and identity language. So in other words, she's saying that when we do it, it's good because we're genuine, right? And she's using the example of, because in the past, gay people were discriminated against, which is true. So we can have rights language because of that. But when you do it, when your rights are then becoming infringed upon for whatever reason, or there's a conflict in rights, then that's bad. And it's a bad faith appropriation of our rights language. I think that's very telling that she's framing it in this way. And the way she's describing the new rights is to eliminate what she calls, or what she refers to as a feminist, is this heteronormative education. So heteronormativity, meaning the assumption that people are heterosexual, and sort of assuming that people get married, or assuming people have what's called normative heterosexual relationships. And so that in and of itself is in conflict with LGBT rights, is what she's saying, which is kind of a problem, but we won't get into it. That's kind of what she's saying here. So we keep hearing that these LGBT rights don't take away from other people's rights. We hear that all the time, that it's not a zero-sum game. But she's telling you here, yes, she's very aware that this new postmodernist approach, like the elimination of what she called this new thing that's called heteronormativity, which is an oppressive in and of itself, is coming in full conflict with a lot of people, actually. Like if we think, for example, having males and female jails, there is a very distinct infringement upon the right of females to be free from sexual predators in prisons, for example. But we're talking about a school context here, which is a little bit different. But she's saying that teaching the postmodernist queer theory idea that's the cis heteronormative patriarchal society is oppressive, and that we must change the so-called gendered language to have gender equity, which really just means that male and female no longer exists, that we're all sort of gender creative at the core of it, really, that needs to be put into schools to respect LGBT rights, which is my opinion is a bastardization actually of just gay equality, because it's not equality, it's about imposing an ideology which she's framing as rights. So Lauren, to me, understands that any majority group is bad and any minority group is good, because majority groups in this kind of context is always oppressing a minority group, and therefore you must center the marginal and then push the majority out into the margins. So that in and of itself is rooted in an ideology of power and privilege, which we can't track, we cannot test, we cannot prove to actually be the case. In fact, there's a lot of research showing that this actually creates a more hostile environment rather than creating a beneficial one for all parties involved. So in other words, the way to solve past discrimination in this case by the heteronormative family structure, is current discrimination of that particular group, parents, the heteronormative family structure, in the education system today. I just want to note here too, before we carry on, that some parents are socially conservative in this movement that are pushing back. That's true. But not all parents are even socially conservative or conservative at all. I've been a lifelong liberal voter, green, in fact, you would even call woke. I know a lot of people who would consider themselves very liberal, even socially liberal. So watch out for this framing, really, because she is going to frame this as this is a problem from social conservatives, the way that the little bed sheets that Mr. Adler was talking about too. So this is the kind of person that is objecting to having gender ideology, to having queer theory, or even comprehensive sexuality education, which is another topic that I should cover at some point. But any opposition to that is just these religious social conservatives, which is not true. Actually, that's just not true.
Parents who oppose LGBTQ rights, parents who are fundamentally only interested in delivering a socially conservative curriculum relating to the family and gender, have therefore appropriated identity and rights language to say, but now you're trampling our rights. This is a false dichotomy. This doesn't mean that there's nothing to parents' concerns. As Lisa said, we can understand a number of ways that parents may have legitimate concerns about curriculum that changes quickly or is passed without consulting them or whatever, but that doesn't mean that they have the same kinds of rights to be protected from discrimination in the way that minority groups do, or that parents' rights are a function of kind of universal human rights. Next slide, please. So is there a conflict of rights going on here? Click. We can understand conflicts of rights as the interests of different stakeholders clashing and needing to be resolved in a pluralistic society. The structure of many political dilemmas, and especially education dilemmas, has this form. It seems like different people's interests are coming into conflict. So here's the group of stakeholders who call themselves parents are claiming rights, although as I just explained, rights language is a bit forced in this case, but they have interests. Whom are their interests coming into conflict with? You can just click a bunch of times, Lisa, because I had this animated. First of all, the government. So the government, as we said, is the origin of public schooling. And ironically, of course, most people in government are also parents. And a lot of parents work in government or work in education. So this is apples and oranges. These are not groups of people with distinct identities that never overlap. But parents may claim that their rights are being encroached on by the overreach of the government, and therefore they need to reassert their, scare quotes, rights as parents. But there are other stakeholders in this picture. Keep clicking. There are the educators, and let's not forget the children. So how are these all related? The educators, at least in public schools, do represent an arm of the government, and parents may therefore claim that they are in conflict with educators, which is partly why they storm school board meetings and sometimes argue with or even try to intimidate their children's teachers, because they say, I'm the child's parent, you're just a teacher, I have more of a right to raise my child than you do.
Correct.
But again, this is a false dichotomy. A, teachers and educators are mostly parents as well. B, although they may work for the government, that doesn't mean that they even agree with everything that the government says or even the curriculum they're required to teach.
Oh my
Educators
God.
actually teach under a lot of stress because they have to implement curricula and policies that are not generally their personal choices, but just what the state or the jurisdiction is telling them. And most fundamentally, the stakeholders that everybody is fighting over here are the children.
Okay, I hope you understand what we've just heard, because I find this absolutely unbelievable. So let's break it down just a little bit. She is saying the state, through teachers and the education system, believes it has an interest in raising your child, and that you, as a parent, are just one of many stakeholders in that obligation. Never mind the fact that she's saying, oh, because there's no, are there really conflict? It's apple and oranges between parents, the government, and educators, because some educators are parents and some people in the government are parents. And so that means that they're not really in conflict, which is a ridiculous argument to be making here, because the government makes the laws that the educators are then following. The educators have teachers' unions, which make them put in place certain policies. The parents, we don't have that. So that is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. But the crux here, listen to the language that she is using. She's saying the state has a stake, is a stakeholder in raising your children. And remember from the ETFO document, she said that she believes, without even being a teacher, because she's a philosopher ethicist, that she believes they absolutely must be taught gender ideology and queer theory in school, because that's what's being argued in this court case, really. That's what people are getting upset about. Teachers are civil servants providing a service. They're not parents. They're not in charge of the moral upbringing and the cultural upbringing of your children, but she's saying they are. According to Lauren, everyone is fighting over the children. She's right in that analysis. Everyone here is fighting for the moral and cultural and social upbringing of your children. And she believes they have some kind of stake or interest in this. This is why state schools, in my opinion, have completely lost the plot. They see themselves as having this special authority over the lives of families. And frankly, we'll get to it later, but reproduction itself.
No, it makes sense that children wouldn't themselves be determining curriculum or education policy. But whoever is making the decisions, all curriculum and education policy should in principle be designed with children's interests in mind. So the government says they're protecting children. Parents say they're protecting children. Teachers say they're protecting children. How can all these things be true at the same time if everybody is disagreeing and claiming their rights are being trampled? What is happening here is an unfortunate outcome of the way that liberal societies structure rights, which tends to pit individuals and groups against each other and overlook the ways that we actually have shared aims and need to cooperate in the interests of other groups. In this case, children actually depend on parents and teachers and many other adults working together. So arguing that one group or one individual has rights that trump the authority of the other group or the other individual tends to deprive children of their due regard, that I think are pretty deliberate and.
Oh, sorry, I made a little boo-boo there. Let me go back.
That we actually have shared aims and need to cooperate in the interests of other groups. In this case, children actually.
Why does the state need to cooperate in the raising of your children? Why? Why is this an obligation?
Actually depend on parents and teachers and many other adults working together. So arguing that one group or one individual has rights that trump the authority of the other group or the other individual tends to deprive children of their due regard.
So she's saying that that conflict of rights of the government, so the state having a stake, an interest in raising your child on some kind of even par, it seems, that, we should all be working together because, we don't want to be in conflict with the interests of the government raising your child because there's a decided moral authority from the government that's been disseminated through teachers. And so don't fight with them because we're all raising your children. Well, you need to be aware that the state believes that they're raising also responsible for raising your child, and they do it through the education system because here in Canada, you can't opt out in the same way that you can necessarily do in the USA. This is obligatory.
Although there's no universal declaration of the rights of the parent or convention on parents' rights, as Lisa mentioned, this is very much in flux, especially in the United States. They are attempting to get parents' rights enshrined more formally. Children's rights have, in fact, been recognized internationally for many years, and children's rights are defined in such a way, very insightfully, I think, that the authors of the Convention on the Rights of the Child are giving parents appropriate authority and leeway in the raising of their children. So the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which you see here, has many, many articles, but I'm just pulling out Article 5, which is blown up on the side, which says that parties, meaning anyone with power, so that could be the government, that could be teachers, that could be educational policymakers, shall respect the responsibilities, rights, and duties of parents, et cetera, in the exercise by the child of the rights recognized in the present convention. What that means is when parents exercise their authority, you can call it rights, but it's also a responsibility and a duty, they should do so with the rights of the child in mind. The rights of the parents are not supposed to be distinct from and in competition with the rights of the child. They're supposed to be harmonious. The reason that we do give parents a lot of leeway in law and in custom in the raising of their children is because in the normal scheme of things, parents actually are best positioned to meet their children's interests.
Smartest thing you said all day.
Educational decisions for their children.
Exactly.
It's not because children are parents' property and parents can just do whatever they want with them. Or normal scheme of things, parents actually are best positioned to meet their children's interests and make educational decisions for their children. It's not because children are parents' property and parents can just do whatever they want with them, or that being a parent, like having successfully reproduced, gives you inalienable rights to control the life of another person.
Oh my God.
That has never been legally enshrined in a universal convention or in American law either. So, well, maybe Lisa can correct me on the history, but I wouldn't want to live in a place where that's enshrined in law.
So Lauren views human familial relationships through the lens of the law and law bodies, legal bodies, giving you or granting you leeway and the right to raise your own child. That's what she's saying. Now, she says, giving authority and leeway in the raising of the children. That's what the UN does, according to Lauren here. So the UN, which is an unelected international body, has graciously given you authority and leeway to raise your own child. So it seems to me they've lost the plot in understanding that family is one of the most fundamental units in biology, or even kin. Giving birth to the next generation is a biological function that is so ingrained in our minds, in our souls, in our very biology. And somehow this is turned into some kind of legalistic language. And this is an ethicist. An ethicist does not seem to grasp that it is not legal bodies, international or otherwise, that gives you or grants you authority and leeway in raising your own children. This is, I don't even believe in God, but this is a God-given natural right that simply exists on the mere basis of being a human being. Now, Lauren, I don't want to live in the world where the government hands out birthing and parenting licenses. Now, she mentions the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which this always comes up. They always talk about how the children's rights should be centered. That's because this idea of the, children's rights is centering, in this case, the marginal, which would be the child. The parent is the dominant, I guess you could say. And so in this ideology, you always center the marginal. But what this does is it parentifies or adultifies young children and grants them a certain level of responsibility and independence that, frankly, is we need to look at that, because like I was saying about the God-given right to raise your own child, it is your kin. You are biologically inclined to protect your own child. And there's a reason that children are not born completely separate from parents, and they do whatever they want. But she brings up the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and she's right. That Article 5 does absolutely say that. But what these people, whether it's Lauren or anybody else that quotes the Convention, the one article they never bring up is Article 29. Now let's read what Article 29 says. It says, Article 29 states parties agree that the education of the child shall be directed to, and let's go to number C, the development of respect for the child's parents, her own cultural identity, language and values, for the national value of the country in which the child is living, the country from which he or she may originate, and civilizations different from their own. So the grand point here I'm trying to make is that it is a right for that child to be raised within the values of their own family, the values of their parents. And what Lauren is telling you by ignoring this and the preamble that we just listened to is that no, we have a new value system. It is a postmodernist feminist value system. It is a queer theory value system, and that should be imposed on the school system. And if there are conflicts between parents who are saying we don't want this and educators saying, well, too bad you're having this, well, we're just going to quote all kinds of legalistic stuff and say that, well, we're granting you leeway, so you better enjoy it, bigot. That is what Lauren is saying here. Now, I would really like all these people quoting the conventions on the rights of the child, they should actually bother reading through the actual convention on the rights of the child.
When we talk about parents' rights, there is no separate list of things to which parents are entitled legally or by convention. And insofar as we do give parents a lot of authority, so yes, parents have more authority over their children than teachers do. I don't think anyone's really disputing that.
Finally.
It just comes down to specific cases. We give them that much authority because it's usually in the best interests of the child. The question is, when there's a conflict, what is in the best interests of the child? Next slide. No, not a slide? Right. Sexuality education, of course, is just a bellwether for all of these conflicts. This is an image taken from a protest over sexuality education in Toronto, where I live. And there's a lot that could be commented on here, but something that's really ironic is when parents are opposing sex education on the grounds of parents' rights or parental choice, they sometimes advertise their hypocrisy like on placards very loudly and clearly. How is it that a child could be standing there holding a sign saying, "My child, my choice," when the parents who gave them the placard are claiming that it is theirs, the parents' choice, what to do with the child? The child does not have any choice here, and the parents are arguing for their political position on the grounds that as parents, they have.
So this is the crazy thing about queer theory. Queer theory views children as autonomous individual. They're like mini adults. And these mini adults have the capacity to consent to just about anything. And in the comprehensive sexuality education, the UN comprehensive set, they talk about sexual citizenship. And sexual citizenship is sort of teaching that you can consent to just about any kind of sex, and you become a full sexual citizen when you are expressing your full sexuality openly all the time. So it's this overtly sexualizing to become a full sexual citizenship, and anybody who objects to that is just a social conservative bigot. Now, let's come back to the idea that children in this view in queer theory, as expressed by Hannah Dyer in a paper called Queer Futurity, describes this idea of the innocent child being a myth. And this myth it really is rooted in a very oppressive, heteronormative, Eurocentric, colonial identity, which is, cis heteropatriarchal, and it must be busted because the inner queerness of children cannot be explored if they're viewed as innocent, because they're protected from we'll use sexual citizenship way of looking at it. They cannot access the full sexual citizenship, and they cannot access their full queerness because of this heteropatriarchal or cis heteropatriarchal society that is keeping them away from that through their developmental years. This is the opposition to that she's having here, saying, oh, those children can't be saying my children, my choice, because they're children. How do they know what they're choosing? It is an incredibly dangerous way of looking at young people. It is, who is protecting those kids? They're out there protesting because those parents, for whatever reason they feel they must, protect those children from something. And they have the God-given right, the natural right to do so if that's how their family values are. Remember the Convention on the Rights of the Child? They have a right to be raised in the values of their parents. So that's what they're doing. So she's right there contradicting or contravening the very UN documentation that she's quoted, because she hasn't read them through. She's picked and chosen the things that she wanted to make her case without actually looking at the entire suite of information that's actually in there. Whenever you hear about children's rights, yes, children should have rights, and there are some cases to be made. There's some intricacies in some of that. Like, for example, we know there are cases where some children are being abused in their home. They need to be removed for whatever reason by the state. So there is an obligation there by the state to protect children who are under duress. But that standard used to be a lot higher, and it's becoming lower and lower and lower as we give children more rights. And the parents, because they're the hegemonic or viewed as the hegemony, and hegemony is bad, and the marginal must be centered, and this inversion. Because of that, then we're putting more and more children in a position that is dangerous for them, because they're not little adults that can consent to things. They're not. And so ultimately, this way of looking at the world is in fact putting an increasing amount of children in danger. And Lauren in this talk is telling you that she believes that it should be imposed. It should be imposed on kids, and parents should not have a decision as to whether or not gender ideology, queer theory, intersectional postmodernist feminism, that worldview should be imposed upon these children. And again, let me bring you back. So these may be social conservative people here, and I'm making an assumption they may be. But I want to reiterate, I'm not a social conservative. Up until very recently, I was borderline what you might even call woke. I believed I was a liberal. I believed I was a very progressive liberal. I voted liberal my entire life. And then I came across gender ideology and queer theory in school, and that completely made me have to reevaluate a lot of these things that are going on. Leftism is lying to you. If you're liberal, listen to me. Leftism is lying to you, because if you strip away the language of diversity, inclusion, equity, if you strip away and see what that actually means, this is an incredibly destructive way of looking at the world, which is libertine. It's a hyper individualistic, in some way, libertine and chaotic way of understanding the world that views the world in terms of oppressors and victims. And this is not helping anyone at all. Let's just listen to the rest of this clip.
Have final, maybe even exclusive authority over their children. So whose choice is it really? Children are clearly being enlisted at an age when they're far too young to object, to secure their so-called parents' rights without even understanding what's at stake. This is just an illustration of the false dichotomy between parents' rights and children's rights. Therefore, to conclude my little section here, parents' rights, not legally enshrined, not universally recognized. There is no slate of things to which all parents are entitled just because they reproduced.
And this is why we need parents' rights to be enshrined if this is the road we're going down, Lauren.
But the rhetoric of parents' rights very successfully agitates people and picks up on other kinds of interests and values that we probably do want to recognize. We do want to recognize that parents are and should be very involved in their children's sexuality education, and that sometimes the government or teachers do things that we want to object to. And as parents, we have to have appropriate mechanisms for expressing that dissent.
Let me just point out that parents in Canada, some of the social conservative varieties, some may be religious, but a lot who are not at all. I've known NDP voters who've objected to this. I know a lot of, in fact, all the people that I know in the parents' rights movement that I work with personally, I would say, well, more like 90% are liberals. They're not even religious. And so this is false. And these parents in Canada have been trying to discuss this for a long time. They have been delegating at school boards and they've been locked out. They've had their delegation times cut short. They have been told or fobbed off. They have had tried to protest after a long time. They've brought to the attention of the school some of the sexualized materials in schools. The parents have been doing so many things. In fact, at the minute, it's come down to the point of having to log complaints, and at each and every turn are being ignored, are being, they're viewed like Lauren here is viewing. Well, they're just all social conservative bigots. And how Mr. Adler himself pointed out that, well, these are just bedsheet wearing KKK members, and so we don't have to listen to them. And so the dismissal, she sounds very reasonable in this, very reasonable, but this dismissal saying, oh, well, they have appropriate mechanisms. Well, I can tell you that parents have been trying to go through all of the appropriate mechanisms, and it has got to a point of contention where protests have started. The Million March for Children is a really good example of the kind of protests that have erupted from this, or even local school board protests when parents have been physically locked out of buildings or removed when they've tried to express a dissenting opinion. It has become an incredibly contentious topic, and parents have been trying to go through the appropriate pathways, and it seems to me that there's only going to be more and more obfuscatory or policies put in place. For example, school board meetings. A lot of parents started delegating, and so school boards all over Ontario have started putting measures in place. I think BC as well, to do things like limit time, like vet who can speak, right? So that they want to say, well, we don't want to hear any of that stuff. The Karlyn case is a really good case in point. An ex-teacher who brought to the attention of the school board material that was inappropriately sexual in the schools, whose delegation was cut short and then went through a whole legal process ever since, and now owes money. And the school board has used human rights legislation as an excuse to do that. And now we have a Lawyers Against Transphobia document, which is giving lawyers tactics basically on how to shut parents down, on how to get them to be quiet, on how to, because it's all framed as transphobia. And so I'm really sorry, Lauren, but I know you sound really sensible. This all sounds really nice. And in a perfect world, yes, parents would have a course, a pathway to reasonably talk about their objections. But when you are ignored, you have legal systems against you. Now the new Senate appointee calling these parents bedsheet wearing KKK people. I think we're past that. So I would like to see that veneer come down and more honesty be put forward.
And for advancing our own values. None of that translates into parental monopoly over sex ed. Because in addition to parents, you have teachers, you have children, the government, policymakers, as well as healthcare professionals like nurses, as well as community leaders, including clergy people, many of whom have legitimate, valuable roles to play in the sexuality education of children. As I said before, all of the adults' activities should, in principle, be oriented toward the well-being of children. Children's rights are kind of the linchpin here, not parents' rights, but children's rights. Even if it's the case that parents have the next most importance after children in this list here. But we know, again, from research and from historical experience, that children's needs are best served when all the adults fulfill their respective roles. That doesn't mean they have to agree about everything. It means that they all have to be trusted sources of information and support for children, and that trying to reduce the children's circle of support to one stakeholder or one particular message tends to put in danger children who don't have access to other views and other sources of information. I'm not sure if there's anything else on this slide.
Okay, so that's basically the end. So I'm just going to say it. The government and academics like Lauren Bialystok absolutely have overreached here. And the reason that there are conflicts and the reason that parents don't want any of these people involved is because of that overreach. It is an ideological overreach. The stuff that they want, that they're putting in schools now, is it's a contestable, untested ideology based in belief, no different to a religion. So this is entirely based in belief. Postmodernism is just a set of beliefs that believes that all beliefs are equally valid, and so science is simply a Eurocentric white supremacist ideology that actually we should listen to myths and legends, which are just as valid to understand the world, which is a ridiculous assertion. So they don't believe in testing. They don't believe in validating information. They just want to impose their own belief system. This is the overreach. I just want to end this video talking about a book that she wrote called Touchy Subject, which I read. She seems to be making herself an expert on sex ed, the history of sex ed, which is fine. And this book is mostly about, it says the history and philosophy of sex education. And it's mostly about the US, because there's a longer history of parents' rights movement in the US. And I think a lot of that was more religiously and religiously motivated in a social conservative sort of way. So I would say that that's probably true. I don't have the ins and outs of the history of it, but as in, were there other objections to it? But there certainly was a religious social conservative element to the historical parents' rights movement in America. And so this book is a lot about that and comparing that to today. But in the current Canadian context, I find that Lauren's analysis is lacking, because the contemporary parents' rights movement involves a lot of people who I keep saying are neither religious and neither social conservatives, although it can include those people. The objections to this stuff for some are similar to the objections in the past, like objecting to it on religious grounds. Some people do. But that's not the case for everyone. People like myself, for example, which is a growing number and a large number of people objecting to this, parents objecting to this, are objecting to the ideological nonsense that is being pushed under this guise. And through actual scientific analysis, David Haskell's a really good example of showing how DEI type of stuff, how this ideological imposition on young people is actually harming rather than helping, using science, the thing that we're saying is an oppressive force, isn't helpful. The amount of kids that are transitioning through the education system in Canada is huge. And so the objection to some of this stuff is not at all coming from a Christian or religious conservative right. And she doesn't really talk about that very much. And so I thought it would be really useful part of the reason it took me so long to make this video about Lauren and her ideas was I wanted to reach out to Lauren, which I did. I reached out and I wrote an email saying, I read your book. I think you're missing some context in the contemporary parents' rights, because it is a substantially different kind of objection, specifically when it comes to gender ideology and queer theory in the Canadian context. And fair enough, she wrote back, and she wrote me a long text, very politely, basically telling me that I was wrong, sending me a news article about the Million March, which is funny because I was involved in essentially doing the Million Marches quite heavily, but never mind. She sent me that. Basically, it was I'm right. I'm aware that it's a bit different, but I'm kind of still right. And I'd be interested in hearing more from you. So I invited her to meet up in person, have a coffee and have a chat about it. And I got ghosted. So that's why it took me so long to make this video. Now, I mean, Lauren, if you do come across this video, I would still sit down and talk to you, because while frustrated, the frustration comes from people like yourself not listening. I would be very, very happy to discuss things with you. I will be honest, I'm coming from a different ideological position, which is neither religious, nor is it right-wing, nor is it socially conservative. So I can explain to you why that is a false assumption about people and why spreading that is especially dangerous these days. And I can give you very well-explained arguments to why I believe that the postmodernist feminist approach is completely unhelpful from my perspective. I would still love to have a chat with you. I've offered it to many people. In fact, I even offered that same very thing to Charles Adler himself. Now, the problem with all of this is Lauren, when it comes to the legal aspects that she talks about, the policy aspects, is actually correct. She is correct. There is no such thing as parental rights in Canada. There is a distinct use of children's rights, in my opinion, in a way that is especially unhelpful. But she's right. So there's no such thing as parental rights. But I truly believe that the current trend of shutting people out on the belief that they are these social conservative KKK bigot people is not actually going to solve this problem in any way, shape, or form. What that has resulted in is people doubling down and more people getting angry. There's no coming to some kind of consensus here. It's just fueling the flames all the time. So like I said, in this country, the view that she is expressing is supported by the law. Now, the Parents' Rights Coalition of Canada have a summit, and in one of our summits, law professor Bruce Pardy gave a talk about the state of parental rights in Canada and what that means for you. And if you haven't had a chance to listen to it, if you haven't had a chance to go through it with a fine-tooth comb, I'm going to add it at the end of this video. But right now, the law states that we don't really have those rights. And so if you want to understand a bit better the ins and outs of that and what you can do, then I would highly recommend listening to this, to Bruce Pardy. Like I said, he's a law professor, and he will give you some a factual understanding of where you stand today. Okay, so here's Bruce Pardy.
A quote that was contained in the video that Melanie showed us this morning. Well, I guess it wasn't this morning, it was early afternoon. No.
If
Yes.
you're in BC, it was this morning. Yep.
Okay.
We've got people from coast to coast.
So here was the quote. Somebody on that video said, "Parental rights are not a thing. They are not real." And the problem is, the legal problem is, that's largely true. Now, I'm talking legally here. I'm not talking morally. I'm not talking that that parental rights shouldn't be a thing. They should be a thing. But if they weren't a thing, then provinces like Saskatchewan wouldn't need to pass parental rights bills because they would already be there. But they're not. They are not embedded in the system. And that's not surprising because of how we got here. So I want to ask this question. Why do we have a public school system? And I don't mean now just, I mean from the very beginning. Why did we originally invent a public school system? And way back when, it was because I think that people thought that if you left children to their parents, they wouldn't get a proper education. You know, they'd be sent to into the fields or into the mines. They wouldn't be taught reading, writing, and arithmetic. And schools used to teach those things. But in other words, the premise, even back then, was that children should not be left to their parents to educate. And that is the same premise we have now. The curriculum may have changed, but the premise is the same. And if I can put it in crude terms, I think we should put it this way. Well, first, before I go there, let's just have a look at the Education Act of Ontario. I'm going to use Ontario references here, but the story is the same pretty much across the country. Every province has an Education Act or the equivalent. Every province has a Human Rights Code or the equivalent. This is what the Education Act of Ontario says. A strong public education system is the foundation of a prosperous, caring, and civil society. Now, what does that mean? It implies the following, that if you do not have a public education system, then you will not have a prosperous, caring, and civil society. In other words, if you leave children to their parents, you will not have a prosperous, caring, and civil society. Subsection 2, the purpose of this school system is to provide students with an opportunity to realize their potential. Again, implication, if we don't have public schools, if you leave education to the parents, students will not get an opportunity to realize their potential. Parents are the problem. And finally, as we all know, there is a rule in these acts that say attendance is compulsory. Now, that sounds like that rule is aimed at the students. And of course, they mean the students have to go. But the rule is aimed at the parents. Here is what you must do. And so I'm going to put it crudely. We have public schools and have always had them because parents are the problem. They're incompetent, they're ignorant, they might be poor, might be negligent, and they are oppressive. So it is not surprising that parents do not have rights, because when parents come forward wanting to interfere in the way schools are run, this premise rears its ugly head. Now, a lot of people inside the schools might not even frame it this way, might not be aware of it, but it is deeply embedded. Parents should go away and let us do our job, because we have the expertise. We know what we are doing, and parents, you do not, which is why we have schools in the first place. So, and this is all for the purpose of trying to help people think strategically about this problem. I think it's important that we see how the proponents of all of this see the situation. Here's how you might see it. You're envisioning you and your child as a unit and dealing together with schools. Schools, after all, are providing a service, and you want that service to serve your child. And you expect to be able to at least influence the schools on how they perform that service. That is not how the schools see it at all. Because of this premise, you and your child are not a unit. You and your child are two separate people, and they exist to help your child escape you. They see their function as stepping in between you and your child, so your child can be educated properly, because you are an obstacle to that goal. So when you insist upon dictating what books are in the library, or what sexual education your child will receive, or what the ideology is supposed to be, you are demonstrating to people in the schools that you are dangerous. Now, yes, it's all based upon an ideology, and it's based upon a curriculum that has grown up over the past, few years into a very strange place. But nevertheless, the premise still applies, which is the reason why the people who run the schools resist the idea that parents must have a role. Now, I'm exaggerating a little bit, of course. We have parent councils. We have all kinds of things that you might be able to do with your child. But what I mean is, in terms of running the school, in terms of influencing the curriculum, the policies, the teacher, the principal, there is great resistance, and it makes sense that there would be, because of where the schools have come from. So let's talk about human rights. I mean, you have human rights, don't you? Your child has human rights, doesn't she or he? And the answer is, well, on paper, but the meaning of human rights is changing. So let's go back again. Where do human rights come from? What do they mean? So originally, they were conceived to liberate people from the oppression of the state. You might have included in the idea of human rights the idea that you couldn't be locked up without a trial in terms of, due process. You couldn't be tortured, and all these other kinds of ideas that would sort of draw a line between you and the oppression of state force. But today, that is not what human rights mean. They have been turned on their head. And human rights today, instead of being primarily applied against governments, as constitutional rights are, as in our charter, human rights today can be applied by one citizen against another. And in that sense, they have been weaponized. They've become a zero-sum game. And you are on the short end of that stick. And here's why. Here's the Ontario Human Rights Code. And as I say, there's one of these in each province, as well as a federal one. They're very similar to each other. Here's what the Ontario Code says. Every person, that is every individual, has a right to equal treatment with respect to a whole list of things. And you're probably familiar with what those things are. And they include, of course, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and so on. But the idea here is that you and your child having your human rights should be able to influence or at least demand that you be treated equally by schools and, for that matter, by the healthcare system and so on. That is not how it's going. It's not going that way because there are two competing ideas about equality in the law. The words of the Human Rights Code reflects one of the ideas, but the other idea is taking over. The first idea is the idea you probably have in your head. And it's the idea that the word suggests, which is everybody has a right to equal treatment, or if you like, equal protection, or if you like, a right to have rules applied equally. It's also called formal equality, sometimes called equality of opportunity. In other words, blind justice. We're all entitled to be treated the same way. Now, that might seem uncontroversial. And at a certain moment in time, it would have been. But not today. Today, there is a different, opposite idea. And that idea is not that everybody is entitled to equal treatment, but that some people are entitled to unequal treatment, that different rules and standards apply to different people to achieve the same or comparable burdens or outcomes. We call this equity, or equal outcomes, or substantive equality. Now note, there's a term here that can confuse. This term, equality of opportunity, can be used to denote one and the other. And unless you know the context, the person who uses that phrase might mean the first idea and might mean the second. So we started off with the first idea. That was the idea that the Human Rights Code was intended to reflect. It's the way it's drafted. And instead, over time, that idea has been replaced by the second idea. Not completely, not in a black and white way, not suddenly, but in a gradual way so as to lead our Human Rights Tribunal to make the following kinds of observations. Now, Peter's right. There are not very many cases across the country about transgenderism itself. But you can see the trend on the little bit we have and the cases on other topics. You can see what the trend is and how it's working out. Here is a quote from a case not about transgenderism, racial discrimination. This is a complaint brought on behalf of a white boy who applied to take part in a program and was denied because he was white and complained about discrimination. And the tribunal said this: an allegation of racial discrimination or discrimination on the grounds of color is not one that can be or has been successfully claimed by persons who are white and non-racialized. In other words, not everybody is entitled to be protected from discrimination. That now is not what the Human Rights Code means. Here's another one. Again, a complaint from a man, this time not a transgender or gender non-conforming person. He was lodging a complaint because of alleged discrimination because of his, quote, male behavior, seeking protection under the code for engaging in gender conforming, not non-conforming, gender conforming expression. That is, expression that may be viewed as stereotypically male. Here's what the tribunal said. In my view, the ground of gender expression cannot reasonably be interpreted to protect the right of cisgender men to express themselves in ways that may be perceived to be stereotypically male. In other words, I'm sorry, this is not for you. The Human Rights Code is not for you. Now, what do they mean? What they mean is that the code has been taken over by the ideas of social justice, critical theory, critical race theory, and wokeism. And what I mean by that is the Human Rights Code and its powers and its rules now seek, instead of applying the same rules to everybody, now seek to engage in reverse discrimination so as to protect so-called vulnerable groups and flip what is sometimes referred to as the privilege pyramid. You may be familiar with that. You know, the predictable people are on the top and the predictable people are underneath, and they want to apply rules so as to flip that power dynamic around. In other words, in society, the theory goes, all relationships are based upon oppression. And if you are an oppressor at the top of the pyramid, then it's not possible for you to be discriminated against. Instead, only those on the bottom are able to complain. Here's another one. This is another tribunal case, a complaint about a classroom situation in which the teacher was teaching some of the kind of material that has been talked about today, and made a statement that there is no such thing as girls and boys. Now, the tribunal found that this was not discrimination against the complainant was on behalf of a girl. It does not distinguish between boys and girls, and therefore does not result in the erasure of one group as opposed to another. So this is kind of it's a bit of a cheat, right? The statement that there is no such thing as boys and girls, of course, does not distinguish between boys and girls. That's the point. There's no such thing as those two categories. In other words, gender is a spectrum. And the complaint that you are, by that statement, eliminating my belief that I'm a girl has been dismissed here because it does not distinguish between boys and girls. And of course, the tribunal goes on again to say, make an observation in the same kind of respect that I referred to earlier, which is that the protections of the code for cisgendered persons is not the same as for transgendered individuals. Why? Because transgendered persons are a historically disadvantaged group who face extreme social stigma and prejudice in our society. So they have the right not to be discriminated against, but you don't. And so let's look at the Ontario Human Rights Commission. Peter's observation that these policy statements from bodies like the Commission are not formally binding in the sense that they're not an enactment of the law is quite true. Yet, they are very influential. And the tribunal, when they hear cases, have reference to these things. And it is a role that they have in their statutes. So they are not irrelevant. Here's a couple of things that the Human Rights Commission says about gender identity and gender expression. Trans people should have access to washrooms, change rooms, and other gender-specific services and facilities. Now, you see how this is now becoming a zero-sum. Because if trans people have access to washrooms of that nature, then those washrooms and change rooms are not able to be designated for girls who were girls at birth. You can't have it both ways. Either they're open access or they're not. Organizations should design or change their rules, practices, and facilities to avoid negative effects on trans people. Okay? Not that they should change their rules or practices with respect to cis people. I don't like that word, but nevertheless, you know what I mean. But only for trans people. And of course, organizations are liable for not accommodating a trans person's needs. Not a non-trans person's needs, but a trans person's needs. It's a zero-sum game. And in the case of the Ontario Human Rights Code, Some of this has even been codified. This is section 14 of the same act that I read from before. This is, if you like, the codified exception to what appears to be a universal right against discrimination. A right not to be discriminated against is not infringed by the implementation of a special program designed to relieve hardship or economic disadvantage or to assist disadvantaged persons or groups to achieve or attempt to achieve equal opportunity. There's that phrase, equal opportunity. In this case means equity, means substantive equality, means equal outcome. Now you think, okay, well, this is like affirmative action. Sure. And we have affirmative action exception even in our charter. And we've had affirmative action programs for a long time. So, okay, but it goes on in section 1410. So section 14.1 says, okay, you can put together a special program. If you really need to do this on a particular occasion, you can put a program together and we'll tolerate it for, for that time. But 1410 says, oh, by the way, even if you don't actually have a program, even if you're just doing discrimination against that group on behalf of that group, well, then that's going to be okay. Even if the program has not been designated as a special program, the tribunal can find that it's fine. In other words, that guarantee that I read out to you in section 5, that everybody has a right to be free from discrimination, in effect now is not true. Not if you belong to the wrong groups. So, what are we to make of this? It means that you and your child together, thinking that you can use your human rights to get fair treatment from schools and, for that matter, from the healthcare system, are proceeding on a false premise. It looks more like this. You are separate from your child, and the school system, and the healthcare system, and the human rights regime are there to protect your child from you. Let's go further. Here's what's happening. I mentioned this privilege pyramid, where some groups are on the top and oppressors, and other groups are on the bottom and they're being oppressed. You and your child are separately on that pyramid, and here's where you are. You are the oppressor. Your child is the oppressed. The role these institutions think that they have is to protect your child from your oppression. And so when you come along and say, well, you can't teach my kid about that, you are demonstrating that you are dangerous, because they are proceeding on a set of ideas that is embedded in a certain ideology, and they are the ones in control. They genuinely think that this is their job. Now, I've included healthcare there for a reason, and the reason is this, that healthcare is part and parcel of this transgenderism phenomena. But it's also relevant to other kinds of things like vaccines. And some people are not aware. The assumption I think that many people carry around is that as a parent, they have to give consent before their child is subjected to medical treatment, whether it's a vaccine, whether it's puberty blockers, whether it's a program or a plan, whether it's a diagnosis, that the medical system won't engage with their child until you've signed off. Now, sometimes in practice, that's true, but it's not part of the law. The law says this: a person, and a person is not just an adult, a person is a person of any age. A person is capable of giving consent if the person is able to understand the information that is relevant and able to appreciate the reasonably foreseeable consequences of a decision. Okay, well, that sounds fine because, your 12-year-old is not capable, and you know that they're not because they do all kinds of crazy things, and you know how they think. And so you think, well, it's fine because he's not going to fit in that category. Here's the problem. That's not your call. That's the health practitioner's call. And the statute goes on to say a person, child or adult, is presumed to be capable. Furthermore, that healthcare practitioner is entitled to rely on the presumption. So if your healthcare practitioner in the school or wherever evaluates the child, talks to them, has a conversation with them, and it judges whether or not they think they're mature enough and intelligent enough to understand the consequences of the decision that they're making to get or not get a vaccine, for example. And that healthcare practitioner turns out to be wrong. Then that healthcare practitioner is not liable, which means that you actually don't have the kind of protection that you think. So maybe I'll just stop there and just say a few concluding thoughts. You need to have parental rights, but you don't. And it's no good to pretend that you do and insist that you do when you actually don't. The document that Peter was taking us through is, as he was saying, a very reasonable document. But my take would be that this is not the kind of issue that is going to be resolved reasonably, because the folks who are in charge of the institutions don't want to resolve it in that way. They are in control, and they believe that their role is to protect and educate your kids from you. And the compromise that suggests that you should have a role, that you should be informed, that you should get consent, that the whole thing should be under your supervision, runs completely up against that idea. You can't be the oppressor if the oppressor is being given a role. That defeats the whole project. And so in a way, what we need is legislative reform, but that may or may not happen. It may be happening in Saskatchewan. The prospect for that, I can't predict. Maybe it's possible. I don't know. But before that happens, the more important thing is that you get an overwhelming rejection on behalf from parents in the jurisdiction in which you live, who basically say this will not do and cause the powers that be an enormous political problem. You got to have that. Otherwise, I think things are pretty much going to carry on as they are. There'll be a whole lot of window dressing, perhaps, to appease, but you're not really getting at the core of the problem. The core of the problem is the premise, and the premise is that parents don't know what they're doing. I'll stop it there.
Wow. I'm sure that our attendees are going to watch that presentation a few times, Bruce. I know I am. Yeah, I'm naively optimistic sometimes, and you just gave me a serious reality check. I have a question from Kathleen Lowry.
Sure.
A couple of them actually, and I think maybe I'll read them both and share. What's the standing of decisions made by human rights tribunals? Is there a tribunal of tribunals, like the way there is there a way for the Supreme Court to review some of these things? We know that these bodies are quasi-constitutional, if that's the right description. Are there some checks and balances for these non-elected bodies?
Well, so when you get a decision from one of these tribunals, one thing that you can do is you can take it to a court for a judicial review of the decision. But that is not the same thing as an appeal. The law that reviewing court will apply is very lenient. In general, what it will do is consider whether or not the tribunal's decision was reasonable. And what they mean by reasonable is not that they think it's a good decision. They mean that within the boundary of the statutory authority that the tribunal has, is the decision so outrageous as to have no rational basis whatsoever, that we have to quash it. If that's not the case, well, then we're going to defer to it and let it go. So it is much less effective than an actual appeal, and it is certainly much less effective than starting again inside a courtroom. People I think that there are robust checks and balances on this system, and I would suggest to them that there really are not.
Wow. It's going to take me a while to digest that, Bruce. Really important presentation. And I believe it gives a lot of parents and grandparents who've tuned in across the country to listen today and to learn from what people are doing and experts like yourself.
Now, one thing I didn't cover, but is also relevant, is that we also have, as people will know, a charter section that guarantees equality. And that's another story in and of itself. But essentially, the story there, the trend there is pretty much the same. That section in the charter appears to give all of us the individual right to be free from discrimination, just like in the Ontario Human Rights Code. But the way the Supreme Court has interpreted that charter section over the past almost 40 years essentially has ended up basically in the same place, requiring equality of outcome between groups.
So we need to keep getting politicians' attention like we did last year.
No doubt.
Wow. In the interest of time, I know I've got tons and tons of questions, Bruce. But in the interest of time, I think I need to move on because we have a panel presentation.
Yes.
This is incredibly valuable. I'm very grateful that you shared your time and your expertise today. And you give us tools for this in the upcoming engagement and plans to make this a bigger public issue this year than last. Yeah.
Well, listen, thank you very much, Shannon, for having me. I appreciate the invitation to chat. If I had to part with a last thought, it would be that I think it's important in this kind of project to try to think strategically as opposed to morally, because the moral suasion doesn't work with people who fundamentally disagree with you. So think strategically.
That is great advice. It makes a lot of sense and contextualizes for us, I think, a lot of back channel discussions we've been having over the last couple of weeks, that it's strategic as opposed to moral. Very much appreciated, Bruce.
Thanks, Shannon.
Wise last words. Talk again soon.
Okay.